In my presentation, I'll be talking about four things. The impact channels, we heard about them already from Maximo. I'll try and link them more closely to agriculture. And I'll try and look at lessons from the past, especially the financial crisis has not gone yet through the production cycle to affect agriculture for us to get empirical data on the ground. But we can look at what happened in the past under similar circumstances and perhaps divine what we might want to, what we might see in the months to come. And then I will spend some time talking about the implications for long-term growth and poverty reduction. The reason being that in these times of crisis, we often forget the long-term and much more serious objectives ahead of us. And we focus too much on the short term, and often the responses may be counterproductive. So I would like to, again, center the discussion around the long-term growth and poverty reduction. And then I look at what the policy responses appear to be right now and how they basically fall in line with what the long-term growth and poverty reduction objectives are, and eventually what lessons could be learned for future actions. The impact channels, I'm not going to go in detail. I'll summarize them a little bit. Some of them we got from Maximo's presentation. But basically, agriculture will be affected through four different routes. The first one being the recession that Joachim and Maximo talked about globally, what it does to export demand in general for agricultural commodities, and the changes in prices, and how all that trickles down at the individual country level in terms of export earnings and agriculture sector incomes. The second channel is around financing, the liquidity trap. If, as you've seen in the United States, credit dries out, investments become much more competitive, the competition tightens up, and money becomes less easily available for investment. You would expect foreign direct investment to be falling, and actually press reports that this is happening at quite a large scale and rapid pace in some countries. For developing countries as well, important remittances coming from immigrant labor, which can be up to 2, 3, 4% of GDP in certain cases. Trade credit, less money available. It's very hard for exporters and importers to secure trade credit, which is going to dampen the level of export, at least the growth of exports, and therefore will have a pressure on prices and output. And finally, the same thing at the national level makes it hard for people in the agricultural sector, agribusiness or farming, to get access to finance for their operations. At the macroeconomic level, the third channel here is the depression I talked about, the liquidity trap, and the constraints around trade may end up creating foreign exchange reserves deficits at the level of individual economies, fiscal deficit as well because of taxation relying on trade, export, and imports. Lower levels of fiscal budgets would imply lower levels of investment in long-term growth in agriculture, infrastructure, and extension and research and what have you. And that, of course, will have implication for long-term agricultural growth. And finally, and I have here question marks because it depends on what countries do and what the development community in general does, but responses to the crisis can have serious effects on the potential for growth in the long run and even in the medium run. So I'll be leaving it at that without going into details. We can discuss that in the following sessions. But I would like to look back a little bit. Back in the 90s, we had a series of similar crises. And here we're looking at countries and how they reacted. What this table is showing is, I guess, confirming what we saw from Maximo. And the table is we got courtesy of Derek Heddy from DSG, which is one of our divisions here. It looks like the non-agricultural sector suffers much more than agriculture under similar circumstances. But that's really very little comfort, because everywhere agriculture also has been going down. At least in 50% of the cases, there are positive changes, but very little, really not very much. So the crisis affects everybody. If there's any message here that perhaps makes a little bit of sense, is that agriculture may be the sector of resilience, and perhaps that will help countries and economies absorb the shock and survive it somewhat better. Now, how far agriculture is really going to be affected is going to depend on how open and vulnerable the agricultural sector is. And here I just use a very simple indicator, the share of agricultural trade compared to agricultural GDP, to see how much an agricultural sector depends on trade or is linked to the global markets, and therefore open to things happening around the global economy. We have Asia, the first group, with shares that actually are around 20% low, a ratio of 0.2. Very high around the Caribbean, ratios of all the way up to 6 for some countries. And in each graph, actually, I have, because on the x-axis you have countries, there was no name to put the country names, so I just have for you at the top of the line, at the bottom, the 2 countries in the extreme, and then the other countries are distributed along the graph. Okay, so countries like Trinidad and Tobago and close to them will be suffering quite a bit from changes in the global economy, global agricultural sector. In Africa and Latin America, we have a little bit similar ratios there, but again, you see in the case of Africa, it's around 20% for the countries around that have the lowest. Central African Republic, very, very little. But what it says is that these countries are exposed to the vagaries of the global agricultural market. So you have a recession, you have price hikes, you have price instability, whatever it is going to transmit directly into the economies. Less so in Asia, more so in the Caribbean, and somewhere in Africa and Latin America in the middle. Now, I want to bring this discussion to the long-term challenges, as I said. The real challenge countries are facing is beyond adapting to the finances, the crisis that we have, financial and food. It's really to raise the level of growth and meet the poverty MDG, which is about cutting the rate of poverty by 50% between now and 2015. And I'm using key examples from African countries. The top yellow line is what the poverty rate was back in 1990, which is the baseline. And the red line is where the poverty rate is expected to be by 2015. And the bars are simulations of where countries will be in terms of their poverty levels if they succeeded to maintain a 6% growth rate in agriculture. I have a selected number of countries because we have the simulations only for a limited number of countries. Now, you see that if these countries could maintain a 6% growth rate, some of them will certainly go below the red line, which is beyond meeting the MDG of having poverty by 2015. Some won't. Okay? What is important as well to see is that even if they did, the red line still leaves about 30 to 20% of the population in poverty. So therefore, the responses that are coming up to deal with the financial crisis, i.e. social protection, has an opportunity for countries like these to embrace much more proactive and much more comprehensive social protection policies. But there is a caveat there. If these social protection policies, as I will be saying later, crowd out financing and investment out of agriculture, then you may have a problem. But let the message from this slide be that a high growth rate of 6% in agriculture sustained is going to be sufficient for some countries to meet the MDG of reducing poverty by half, but for a lot of other countries, it won't even be enough. And therefore, the long-term objective of growing to reduce poverty shouldn't be lost, despite the challenges of dealing with the short-term crisis. In this slide, in addition to the growth in agriculture, we simulated how much money will be required to help these countries to grow at 6%. And the orange bars are the annual growth rate of public expenditure. So the challenge is not just high in terms of growing at 6% and sustaining it, but it requires a lot of money to do that. And why is this important? Because in responding to the challenges, you may crowd out investment that you need to support growth. So our challenge, therefore, here is how do you combine your responses to this crisis with your long-term challenge of growing faster and financing that expenditure? And I think there should be a possibility to do that. One way it cannot be done is if the trends of the past continue here. A lot of money going into the social sectors and very little going into investments. Yes, the social sectors have a long-term impact on growth in the long run. And there's no way you can reduce expenditures in the social sectors because of the large, high level of poverty and the strong demand for social services. But is there a way of meeting both the challenge of investing in social services and investing in growth to meet the growth challenges? You look at these graphs, agriculture is at the bottom, education, health, and social services are on the top. Now, to go back to this one, I was saying that there should be a way of combining the two. I think what one ought to be doing here is using the resources that are needed in the short term to provide social protection in a way that it also supports growth in the short run, in the longer run. So while doing social protection, select those activities and those sectors that give you the biggest return in terms of also stimulating growth in the agricultural sector. Not all social services are equal in terms of the impact on agricultural growth. I have a paper on that. I don't have time to go into this, but the paper is available for anybody who would like to look into the theoretical aspect of that. The second thing here is the responses by countries to this crisis can also create another problem, which is going back to policies. Maximo was talking about protection, going back to policies that are going to hurt growth in agriculture and therefore go against the objective of reducing poverty in the long run. The last two columns show the frequency of export prohibitions and price setting and price controls measures that countries have resorted to, undoing the benefits of the reform process from the 80s and 90s. These are examples of African countries, but you have examples in Asia as well. So let me say here what we might want to look at if you want to face the long-term challenge of stimulating growth and the long-term challenge of getting enough investment in agriculture to meet that growth. The way of responding has to take into consideration a couple of things. First, we have to recognize that growth remains the goal. We have a crisis, we have to mitigate it, but we want to grow. I think one first entry point should be in the short term to try and compensate the foreign exchange reserve losses and the fiscal losses, and then ensure that agriculture-friendly responses are adopted by countries. Avoid sectoral policy reversal, going to the old policies of trade, export prohibitions, price controls, and what have you, protectionisms. Avoid worsening the bias against agriculture and public expenditure, crowding out the resources, putting it into short-term social protection. Provide growth-oriented safety nets, therefore, which maximize the short-term growth impact of social investments. And there are packages of social services that can do that. And target should be to raise productivity in agriculture in the rural areas within the context of this crisis. Conclusions. I did not talk about the macroeconomic impacts. Maximo touched a little bit on it. But the most serious impact in the short run is at the macro level. Foreign exchange reserve losses and fiscal gaps. But there are serious ramifications for agriculture. We have differences across the regions, as I said. But one thing is important. The response has to focus on growth in countries that are behind in terms of reaching the MDG 1. And there are many of them in Africa, in South Asia, and also in South America. Finally, the programs being announced by the World Bank, the IMF, and others in social protection should be growth-friendly, growth-oriented social protection policies and programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Ousmane. What will be economic growth in Africa this year? What do you expect?
The first, Yeah, the first estimate was about, as if I needed it actually, the first estimate was about from 6 to 3%, and recently I heard actually people talking about 1.7% this year. With growth rate have been around 5 or 6% over the last 5-10 years. So it's a significant dent.
And when do you expect that it might go up again?
It's hard to say. I think it's going to it's going to depend.
That's why you sit there. That's why you're on the panel.
Yes, there are a lot of variables that will contribute to that. I think it depends on the response. It depends how long the recession is going to last. It depends how long and how deep the financial crisis is going to be. Okay, so I think what is good and very encouraging is that the crisis is happening at a time when the economic conditions in Africa are the strongest over the last 4 or 5 decades. Okay, so the supply base is strong, productivity has been going up. I think if the world economy gets back into shape, Africa should be able to compete.
Thank you. And Ousmane didn't say that development aid plays a role in that.